And it's maybe really fitting that also our keynote speaker is the overall head of the program of publishing and printing arts at program at Pacific Lutheran University, Solveig Robinson. She is associate professor in English, where she teaches courses in English, as well as overseeing the publishing and printing arts program. She's written 2 books, one of which I have, the book In Society, An Introduction to the Print Culture, published in 2014, and A Serious Occupation, Literary Criticism by Victorian Women Writers, which she published in 2003. Well, she's not done writing books. She's going to give us a preview today of her current book project, which focuses on the founding and collection principles of the British Library, including brief references to the National Libraries of Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. The title of her talk is 4 Nations, 4 Libraries, Why One British Library Wasn't Enough. Solveig is a longtime member of the book club, and we are a longtime supporter of the book arts program at PLU. It gives me great pleasure to turn the mic, as it were, the virtual mic, over to Dr. Professor Solveig Robinson.
Thanks, Gary, and thank you 1,000 times to the Book Club of Washington for your faithful support of our PPA program down at PLU. It's really so wonderful and generous, the kind of support that you've given our students over the years. And Lucy is just a shining example of what happens out of that kind of continual support and outreach. So I'm really grateful about that. I'm going to share my screen with you now and get this queued up. Let me see if I can get it. There we go. So this talk, 4 Nations, 4 Libraries, is part of an ongoing book project that I am working on with a colleague who also happens to be my husband. And we are looking at the role of national libraries in creating and supporting national identity in the British Isles. Peter Grosvenor, my partner, is working on sort of more of the socioeconomic or sociopolitical elements of that, and I'm looking more at the historical literary. Between us, we're sort of thinking about, well, you know, what is a national library? What does it do? And what has its role been over the last couple hundred years in the British Isles? So this talk is kind of what I'm going to be talking about is how these libraries got sort of started and established. I'm hoping that you'll get a kind of sense of how complicated it is to have a national library, especially in a state that has more than one sovereign state within it. So I hope you'll find this interesting. Okay, 4 Nations, 4 Libraries, Why One British Library Wasn't Enough. From the mid-1830s to the 1860s, the British Museum Library repeatedly lobbied Parliament for more funds. The principal librarian, Sir Anthony Panizzi, had what French journalist Georges Perrault described as an obsession. He wanted to make the British National Library superior to the National Library of France. As Panizzi explained in repeated parliamentary hearings and in greater detail in an 1845 pamphlet, the British Museum Library was not yet an institution worthy of its sponsor. The collection of printed books in the British Museum is not nearly so complete and perfect as the National Library of Great Britain ought to be, Panizzi argued. Why should Englishmen limit the number of books to the size of the building, rather than enlarge the building in proportion to the number of books which the National Library of Great Britain ought to contain? Yes, he admitted the cost of such an expansion would no doubt be great, but so is the nation which is to bear it. After all, he concluded, what might be extravagant and preposterous to suggest in one country may be looked upon not only as moderate, but as indispensable in another. Panizzi eventually succeeded in creating one of the world's greatest libraries, and historian Ian Willison credits him with establishing the very idea that a national library could be one of the major catalytic agencies in the modern world of politics and culture. But Panizzi's achievement not only drew praise, it also inspired envy. The other nations that made up the United Kingdom in the 19th century, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, all looked towards the British Museum Library in London and wondered just exactly what their share was in a national library that was so remote from their citizens and their interests. As a writer in the Glasgow Herald put it, art and literature cannot be centralized to the extent of having only one center for the British Empire. A British museum at the Antipodes would be nearly as useful to the people of Scotland as one in London. Thus, from the middle of the 19th century onwards, the constituent nations of the UK increasingly insisted on the logic and justice of establishing state-supported museums and libraries that would address the distinct needs and character of their local populations. One British library wasn't enough. When Anthony Panizzi joined the British Museum Library as an assistant keeper of printed books in the 1830s, the institution he joined was far from the great international research library that we know today. And for simplicity's sake, from here on, I'm going to refer to the institution in London as just the British Library, even though it didn't officially take that name until 1972. The British Library was founded in 1753 with core collections from both bibliophiles and various royal libraries. And it had been managed in a very slapdash fashion for its first 70-odd years. The library contained an idiosyncratic and chronically underdeveloped collection of only about 235,000 volumes, and access to the collections was largely restricted to scholars and dilettantes. Journalist and Member of Parliament William Cobbett was probably not alone in his dismissal of the entire British Museum complex as a place intended only for the amusement of the curious and the rich. The original reading rooms were grossly inadequate, even for the original highly restricted clientele, and the numbers who sought admittance were increasing exponentially year on year. Renovations in 1838 increased the number of reading room seats from a mere 120 to around 300, but there were already approximately 30,000 readers' tickets in circulation. The author Thomas Carlyle complained at about that time that he had actually been reduced to consulting a book while perched on the steps of a library ladder, and he complained to a royal commission that the British Library's bad air and crowding invariably reduced him to museum headache. Now, Anthony Panizzi didn't care very much about individual readers' complaints, and he turned down Carlyle's request for a private study room when he was at the library. But Panizzi did want to raise the British Library's standing in the eyes of the world. He doggedly pursued larger and larger parliamentary grants, and he simultaneously pursued the enforcement of copyright deposit laws, both within the UK and throughout the British Empire. These efforts swelled the collection and necessitated a major expansion of the premises, resulting in the building of the iconic round reading room and its innovative wrought iron stacks, which not only provided fire-resistant shelving, but also distributed the weight of the new building and its wealth of books. With the opening of the new round reading room in 1857, the British Library finally began to look the part of a national library for the world's greatest empire. The building was so impressive that it influenced the design of many later libraries, including, ironically, the remodel of the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, the very library that Panizzi had initially set out to surpass, and also what is now called the Jefferson Building of the Library of Congress, that 1897 Beaux-Arts Dome building. Now, shortly after the opening of the new round reading room, the novelist William Thackeray rhapsodized that he had seen all sorts of domes of Peter's and Paul's, Sophia, Pantheon, and I've been struck by none of them so much as by that dome in Bloomsbury. It seems to me one cannot sit down in that place without a heart full of grateful reverence. I have thanked heaven for this my English birthright, freely to partake of these bountiful books. Now, it was true that the British Library had become what Panizzi intended it to be, an imperial institution that was as great as the state that possessed it. But however impressed visitors might be by those bountiful books, there was a problem. England-born, London-based patrons like Thackeray might well feel that the library was part of their English birthright. But the citizens of Britain's other constituent nations were less invested in the Bloomsbury institution. For them, the British Library was not only located far away, but it was associated with an English definition of Britishness that many in the constituent nations increasingly resisted. There were 4 nations in the UK, so why not 4 national libraries? Now, the first calls for distinct national libraries came from Scotland and Wales. By the mid-19th century, Scottish Romantic nationalism had already begun to find expression in such activities as Burns clubs, bringing in the haggis, the adulation of Walter Scott, and the staging of Highland festivals. And Scottish nationalism was rapidly consolidating in the face of English anti-Scottishness. Scottish nationalists began to complain about the inequities of UK tax collection and expenditure, calculating that they were contributing far more to the Westminster purse than they were receiving in goods and services. One group, the National Association for the Vindication of Scottish Rights, issued a manifesto in 1853, asserting that where the affairs of one nation are managed by the men of another, then is the nation neglected or misruled. Patriotism is unknown, and a treacherous and mechanical policy is substituted for a fostering and righteous rule. I wish I could do that with a Scots accent, but I can't. Scottish nationalists insisted on the value and uniqueness of Scottish traditions and institutions, a distinction crystallized in their response to the Crimean War in 1854-1855. What is it, the Scottish Rights Association asked in an 1854 tract, that will cheer our gallant countrymen to the assault of Sebastopol? Will it be the roast beef of old England or Auld Lang Syne? The Walter Scott centenary in 1871 provided another focus for Scottish nationalist expression and prompted renewed calls for the establishment of distinctly Scottish state institutions, including a national library. At about the same time, the first call for a Welsh National Library came in 1860 from Thomas Gee, who was editor of the radical newspaper Ifaner, which means the flag or the banner. Ironically, a library dedicated to Welsh language and culture had actually been created back in 1753, the same year as the founding of the British Museum. However, that library had a very major disadvantage as a National Library of Wales in that it was located in London. After decades of debate in the early 19th century about the standards of Welsh education and the status of the Welsh language, Thomas Gee's call for a new National Library of Wales and in Wales heralded the beginning of sustained pressure on Parliament to establish and support Welsh national institutions. At the same time, the groundwork for those institutions was laid by local supporters. For example, in 1861, the first public library in Wales was established in Cardiff, and it started amassing works on Welsh literature and culture. And in 1872, the first Welsh university was established in Aberystwyth. The following year, at the National Eisteddfod, and the Eisteddfod is a uniquely Welsh cultural festival of music and literature, at the National Eisteddfod in 1873, another proposal was made for a Welsh National Library, and this time a committee was actually formed to look into the matter and get things off the ground. Meanwhile, in Ireland, the creation of a national library was moving forward with no controversy whatsoever, possibly because Ireland had had a state-supported national in all but name library since the 18th century. The Dublin Society, later the Royal Dublin Society, had established a library in 1731 as part of its efforts to support Irish economic development. And the Dublin Society was already receiving a substantial grant from the Irish Parliament before the 1801 Act of Union united Ireland with the United Kingdom. After the Act of Union, The Westminster Parliament continued to support the Dublin Society's activities, including the library, to the tune of about £5,000 a year, which was a fairly substantial sum of money in the early part of the 19th century. When an 1836 parliamentary investigation into library provision in the UK brought the Dublin Society Library under scrutiny, Parliament suggested that the library should endeavor to broaden its holdings and reorganize itself so that it could function as, quote, a national library accessible under proper regulation to respectable persons of all classes who may be desirous to avail themselves of it for the purposes of literary research. Now, this 1836 charge is the earliest example I have found of official recognition that other libraries besides the British Museum Library might have claims to be national in scope. That acknowledgement, combined with the parliamentary grant, may help to explain why the Irish press was virtually silent on the topic of an Irish National Library at this time in history. Although at the same time, this is just in the aftermath of the potato famine, and people were rather distracted by, survival and starvation rather than the provision of literary culture. However, by the time we get to the 1870s, debates about national institutions in all of the constituent countries have become noisier and noisier. The Home Rule movement began to catch fire in both Ireland and Scotland, and Welsh nationalism began to coalesce around the education and Eisteddfod movements. It was in this period of the 1870s that the Irish Home Rule movement saw a swing from unionist to separatist sentiment. Up until this point, Ireland had been really keen to be part of the United Kingdom and really integrated, and they were starting to lose patience. That the National Library of Ireland was officially created in 1877, the very same year that Charles Parnell and other Irish MPs actually began challenging and obstructing Parliament. That might be a coincidence, but in the absence of other evidence, it seems plausible that granting Ireland a national library may have been a relatively small bone to throw to the Irish in the hopes that they would just sort of simmer down and not become increasingly revolutionary. In any event, the 1877 creation of the National Library of Ireland seems to have been fairly uncontroversial. Neither the London nor the Irish newspapers took any particular notice of it. There's a few announcements and that was just it. However, where the Irish National Library did garner press attention was in Scotland and Wales, who began to feel aggrieved about the parliamentary grants that supported Irish national institutions. And ironically, it was the creation of the Scottish Office in 1885, a government bureau dedicated to Scottish affairs based in London. So it was the creation of the Scottish Office in 1885 that caused the Scottish press to become increasingly vociferous. While the creation of the Scottish Office might have been taken as Westminster's tardy recognition of the importance of Scottish issues, Scottish nationalists instead interpreted it as a threat to their local autonomy. If London was going to reach its tentacles northward, then Scotland needed to resist by reasserting its claims to locally administered but still government subsidized national institutions. A Scottish National Library became a pressing need, and the unanimous candidate to form the basis of that library was the Advocates' Library in Edinburgh. Now, the Advocates' Library had been founded in the 1680s for the lawyers or advocates who acted in the Scottish courts. Although the collecting principles of the Advocates' Library were never intended to be comprehensive, many members of the governing faculty of advocates were also bibliophiles. For example, Walter Scott was both a member of the faculty and also one of the librarians of the Advocates' Library. Over the centuries, since the 1680s, many bequests and items of significant Scottish historic value had broadened the library's holdings. And so there was books and manuscripts and ephemera and all sorts of things. Additionally, the Advocates' Library was one of the original copyright deposit libraries in the UK. So the library also contained one of the most comprehensive collections of printed matter in the British Empire. However, copyright deposit had proved to be a double-edged sword. By 1719, just 10 years after the first Copyright Act in the UK, the Advocates' Library had already run out of space. And by the mid-18th century, 1750s, 1760s, it was nearly overwhelmed. There were reports of books being piled on the floor and stacked in the cellars, and the faculty were increasingly concerned about the risk of fire and hopelessly behind in cataloging. New and expanded premises barely made a dent in the problem, and the faculty were forced to consider whether they should surrender their copyright deposit privileges. However, testimonials such as Thomas Carlyle's in 1874 that the Advocates' Library was, quote, incomparably the best of all the libraries we have in Scotland, and in fact, the only library worth calling such, made the faculty of the Advocates' Library really hesitate to do anything to decrease their library's comprehensiveness. Also, the notion of buying materials that would otherwise be provided free via copyright deposit definitely ran counter to the Scottish disposition towards thriftiness. So rather than giving up their deposit privileges, the advocates instead proposed another solution. Since the copyright materials were provided at the behest of the government in Westminster, Westminster should pay for their housing and upkeep. And to this end, in 1889, the Glasgow Herald took up the call for a Scottish National Library with the Advocates' Library as its nucleus. The Herald pointed out that the Advocates' Library's unique collection meant that anyone who wanted to write a full and authoritative history of Scotland would virtually be compelled to reside in Edinburgh and gain access to the library. The Herald further urged that imperial discrimination against Scotland in the distribution of imperial money must be rectified via the funding of this essential national institution. Scottish members of Parliament have been very attentive to the fires of England and Ireland, the writer noted, but they have cared little about the warmth of the domestic hearth. It would not be enough for Westminster just to provide a fairer appropriation to Scotland. Since the Advocates' Library was owned by the faculty, whose fervent desire for financial support for the library never quite extended to a willingness to cede control of it, they would need to be compensated for their valuable asset. Because England has a national library and Ireland has one, the Glasgow Herald reasoned, doesn't mean that the faculty should simply divest the transference of their library to the nation in order that Scotland may have a library also. So, if we're going to have one, you're going to pay for it. The Herald suggested that if the advocates did give up their library for the good of the nation, the agreement should be drawn up between them and all the municipalities of Scotland, so that the municipalities, all of the cities and smaller units, could combine to face down Parliament on the issue of whether Scotland were, quote, bound, according to any principle of justice, to pay out of her own pocket for a national institution, the parallels of which in England and Ireland are supported out of the imperial treasury and therefore partly by Scottish money. Imperial economic justice was fueling debates in Wales as well. In the 1890s, a critical core of Welsh MPs began pointing out the inequities in government expenditure in the constituent nations. However, while the MPs and leading Welsh citizens agreed about the desirability of creating Welsh national institutions, they could not agree on where they should be located. And the proposed site of a Welsh National Library was particularly contentious. The debates continued, sometimes obstreperously, from the 1890s until well into the early 1900s. Now, the two contenders for location were the mostly Anglophone commercial port of Cardiff in South Wales and the largely Welsh-speaking, romantically rural Aberystwyth in mid-Wales. Cardiff was urgently lobbying Parliament to have itself declared the capital of Wales, which it didn't achieve until 1955, and it argued that important national institutions like libraries and museums should most logically be located in the Welsh capital. Aberystwyth, on the other hand, pointed to its proximity to the Welsh-speaking populations of Mid and North Wales and to the fact that it was a home to the first Welsh university. The regional papers in Wales were unabashedly partisan, and their squabbles were crystallized in a much reprinted cartoon from 1899, which shows Aberystwyth and Cardiff in the gown of a sort of Welsh lady's traditional costume, arguing over bookshelves. Now, on the Cardiff side, the Weekly Mail sneered that if, as Aberystwyth supporters claimed, it were necessary for a national library to be in some quiet place, then perhaps the British Museum Library ought to be moved to Capel Curig, which is a remote Welsh village in the heart of Snowdonia. Cardiff, the Weekly Mail pointed out loyally, was the center of more than half of the population of Wales and in direct communication by rail with the other half, advantages that no other Welsh city could claim. And indeed, Aberystwyth is still the end of the line and almost impossible to get to. You basically have to go to Birmingham from any place else in Wales and then cut across back into Wales to get to Aberystwyth. It's silly. If the library were located in Aberystwyth, the Weekly Mail argued, only a small number of scholars would visit it in any given year, and the value of the library in consequence would be lost. If Aberystwyth won the library, Wales for all time will feel its loss, and future generations will have cause to regret our blunders and stupidity. Now, Aberystwyth is charming and beautiful and gorgeous, and it's worth going to Birmingham to get there. But really, you really have to want to get there. And once you're there, you go to the library or the university and you look at the seafront and then you go to bed. So the Northern Welsh Gazette struck back about these claims. Alas for Cardiff, the paper scoffed, but the city's bid for the National Library was specious. Cardiff might be the center of a vast industrial population and very rich, but so what? The Welsh Gazette somewhat prissily explained that a national library, in the sense that the British Museum Library and the Edinburgh and Dublin libraries are national libraries, is not a place where the masses congregate. It is a place merely used by students and scholars. I love the use of merely there. Furthermore, for all its supposed wealth, Cardiff had failed for decades to build a home for the South Wales University College, and it was offering a mere £3,000 a year towards the cost of a national library, an insignificant sum compared to the £600,000 already amassed by Aberystwyth. The Mid-Wales paper, the Aberystwyth Observer, also weighed in, pointing out that while Cardiff had money, it also had only a small Welsh-speaking population. A Welsh library is of no use whatever to a population that cannot read Welsh, it stated, reminding readers that the Welsh-speaking people are not at Cardiff, but in Mid and North Wales. The Welsh-speaking people are not in Cardiff. It's more, I can't do a Welsh accent very well anyway, and my husband would probably kill me if he could hear me just like that. So on one topic, though, the Welsh papers did agree, and that was that wherever the National Library of Wales ended up being located, it should be supported by a grant like the one given to the National Library of Ireland. All the papers reported avidly on the efforts of Welsh MPs William Jones and Herbert Lewis to secure an equitable share of government funds for Wales. The Cambrian, a southern paper based in Swansea, compared Lewis to Oliver Twist, boldly asking for more. Similarly, the Northern Rill Journal opined that the justice of the Welsh plea had been admitted by successive governments, and the concession is only a matter of time. And the Western Mail, in an article cynically entitled "Save Us from Our Friends," asserted that Cardiff shouldn't be expected to pony up for a national library when it was the obvious duty of the government to support such an institution as it did in England and Ireland. As it happens, the difference in the grants made to Wales versus the other constituent nations were indeed striking. In 1903, MP Lewis testified that of the £400,000 allotted annually for British museums, libraries, and galleries around the entire United Kingdom, Wales received only two sums of £26 each towards an exhibition in Cardiff and other small doles of similar character. When the government in Westminster suggested that the Welsh should be satisfied with the offerings of the British Museum in London, Lewis objected that since the British Museum belonged equally to Scotland and Ireland, he elided England there, it did not address the fundamental injustice with which Wales had been treated. And besides, the British Library neither systematically collected nor catalogued Welsh material, either about Wales or in the Welsh language. In the end, in 1907, Parliament did decide to allocate funds for both a National Library and a National Museum of Wales, and in a truly Solomon-like manner, it bowed to Welsh parochialism and approved the siting of the library in Aberystwyth and the museum in Cardiff. Not mollified by receiving half the riches, the Cardiff Times warned that the weakness of Wales has always lain in its divisions, and in future years, the student will regret that Wales divided its forces by placing the National Library at Aberystwyth away from the great bulk of the population and the National Museum at Cardiff. It is as if the British Museum had been placed at Manchester and the South Kensington Museum 100 miles away. Now, poor Scotland, we might have forgotten about Scotland, but Scotland had to wait even longer for the creation of its National Library. In 1922, the Faculty of Advocates finally offered its library for sale to the UK government, and the government turned them down. However, Westminster did agree for the first time in over 200 years to allocate nominal funds to help maintain the library, and it also expressed a willingness to see the establishment of a National Library of Scotland if Scotland were willing to pay for it. Now, that might have ended the matter again, but in early 1923, Sir Alexander Grant, owner of the McVitie's Biscuit Company, he stepped forward offering £100,000 to purchase the Advocates Library for Scotland. The gift, which Grant later more than doubled, provided both an endowment and a building fund. And according to Grant's biographer, he thought it necessary that Scotland should have a national library when London, Ireland, and a small nation like Wales had one. In the early 19th century then, Anthony Panizzi had seen that the British Library's potential to become a symbol of British imperial might, a treasure house that would inspire envy in Britain's perennial rival France, was something that could be realized. Cosmopolitan, London-based British citizens like Thackeray may have shared Panizzi's pride in the library's holdings and in its splendid architecture, but it's clear from debates in the press that the British Library did not inspire the same kind of feelings in other parts of the UK, especially outside of England. The constituent nations of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales wanted libraries that expressed their own distinct cultures and histories within the larger imperial project. And they wanted those libraries to be funded in an equitable way that reflected each nation's contributions, both financial and otherwise, to the greater union. If an essential function of a national library is to preserve and elevate the literary culture of its supporting state, then an enormous and anonymous library located far away from that living culture is bound to feel insufficient. The Irish, Scottish, and Welsh arguments for national libraries show that sometimes size really doesn't matter. The institutions they wanted were not necessarily bigger or better, but theirs. Thanks.
Trying to unmute myself. Solveig, that was fantastic. It's a real tour of British history seen through the libraries. And I mean the issues that you highlight of local autonomy and essentially nationalism within the United Kingdom really resonated in so many different areas. But it's interesting to highlight it through the libraries, and when will your what's the prognosis for your book? Not to put any pressure on you, but I'm sure your publisher probably is asking.
Yeah, well, everything research is mostly done, but then COVID happened, right? And the other complicating factor is there's been a lot more pressure in Britain to sort of examine the imperial roots of collecting in museums and in libraries. And so one of the things I think Peter and I, we've been kind of gathering information on, but one of the things we need to reconsider is how so many of those works got into, especially the British Library, but not exclusively the British Library, how those things got there. And there's the problem of sort of imperial conquest. You know, the British Empire was famous for just hoovering things up, you know, wherever they went, whatever they wanted. But there was a kind of internal colonialism as well in their treatment, especially of Wales and of Ireland. And so, although the relations and interactions between the national libraries now are very cordial, and they share resources and have given the library in Dublin, the library in Edinburgh, priority when certain documents that are specifically related to Scottish culture and Scots Gaelic, or to Irish culture and Irish Gaelic, come on the market. There's still, there's still issues of who should have what, and how are the resources shared, and who's got the ownership, and how did they get the ownership, and all of that has become much more complicated in recent years, just because of protests about where does this stuff come from, and so that's going to take us a little bit of time, but we're really hoping to have a working draft of this book finished this summer. The research is essentially done. But I'm one of those terrible scholars. Like every time it gets close to needing to write something, I think, no, I really need to read another book. So what I just told you is my procrastination strategy, I think. But it's something that's still happen.
Right. I'm trying to blow this up so get a bigger view here. And I want to compliment you on your Welsh. Those are not easy words. You must have to practice a little bit.
It does help having been married to a Welshman for 20 some years.
Oh, fantastic.
Although he's an Anglophone Welshman, but you do get some practice that way. So.
Well, he's going to correct you if you're wrong. So there you go. So
his brother will, that's for sure.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay. Great. So do we have any questions for Solveig? Yes, I see Brian's hand went up first. Brian?
Yes, two questions. You mentioned the British Museum along with the British Library. Are those still associated, or are they two separate entities now? And the second question is, when did the King's Library become part of the British Library?
So the King's Library, I believe, came in 1802, 1803. It was somewhere in there under the Regency, because George IV wasn't all that interested in books and couldn't be bothered. So he gave us all of his father's stuff, let's get rid of that. But there were earlier royal libraries were part of the 1753 collection when the British Museum, including the British Museum Library, were established. The two institutions are still linked in their history and in some of their coordination. But in 1972, the British Library hived off as a specific independent institution. And then with the opening of the new library premises near St. Pancras, that really has made more of a separation. And so that gorgeous round reading room, which was a place that both my husband and I did some of our doctoral research, had the privilege of working in that amazing space that Marx and Wolf and everybody else had been working in for all those years. That is now museum exhibit space. They sometimes put special editions in there. They've got a little bit of the original stacks and catalogs there. But everything is moved a little bit further north to St. Pancras. And I happen to be in, I suppose, a minority of people who worked in both spaces in thinking that the new building is absolutely amazing. And I would far, far, far rather work there with the kind of access that you've got to the materials and comfort and space and quiet and everything else. The reading room was amazing, but I got my own museum headaches like poor old Thomas Carlyle. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it is a fantastic space. There's where they have their special collections or their exhibit is just extraordinary. I'm assuming that it changes from time to time. At the time we were there. And then they have that whole column in the middle of that, the book column of books. Yeah, I guess you can go inside, which we couldn't, but it's got to be multi-stories and quite a dramatic feature of that building. So,
nobody goes in except for the keepers and rather high level keepers at that. Yeah. But you can sign up for tours of their restoration and preservation center, which is located behind the main part of the library, and that's fascinating. And the riches that are in that collection, it's jaw dropping. I've always just loved working there. So. Yeah. I think there's a question from Robert Walls. You saw a hand up.
Hi, yes. Thank you for your description of these wonderful institutions that I can only hope that I'll be able to visit in the future. I haven't been there yet. And I guess what as a user of libraries, I can't help but wonder what kinds of those illustrations showed, a certain class of individual who's using the variety of libraries. And I can imagine that there are might be issues of who is allowed to go in there aside from students, scholars, and respectable citizens. Were there controversies over types of individuals or individuals who represented certain groups that might be considered too subversive to the imperial designs of each individual library, or
good question. The British Library, the British Museum Library, was initially restricted only to scholars who got a letter of recommendation from one of the board of trustees of the library, and most of those people were, professors, members of parliament, and titled nobles, right? Initially, the library was very this National Library was very limited in who was there, but it also had a very limited collection. Women were restricted. There was only sort of one woman who had a reader's ticket in the first, 70 or 80 years of the library's creation. So, and then once the library became more generally accessible, women were restricted to a particular section of the room because their clothes got in the way and they were noisy, of course, so there are all kinds of, I've got a friend who's a Victorian studies person who did a hilarious article about women trying to get into the reading room in the British Library and the uproar and the horror. Punch magazine had a lot of fun with that. But now, so it would have been restricted to educated people who could be vouched for. But now all of the libraries are very concerned about open access. And so, for example, the National Library of Wales provides access to all of its databases to anybody who lives in a postal code in Wales, which means you can get on the internet and click through and access everything that they've got. So they don't have a wall down between it. Scotland, the National Library of Scotland has done similar stuff and is actively engaged in outreach through the public library system in Scotland to make sure that people appreciate that this National Library is not just a repository for scholars and people like me with PhDs, but for all of the people, and it is all of their history that's recorded there. And they've been, for example, there's been debates over the last 10 years or so about Scottish independence, and they've been very carefully collecting ephemera and electronic media and storing tweets and everything about all of this sort of everyday life in Scotland and the course of the nation. So all of the buildings are much more open. That creates some problems. If you ever do get to the British Library in the summertime, the hallways and the reading rooms are choked with undergraduates and high school students who are busy listening to shit on their headphones and watching videos instead of reading the books, and it drives you absolutely batty sometimes. But it's the people's library, and I'm a foreigner coming in to visit, so I'm just grateful that I've got a reader's ticket and I can go into the special collections and put my gloves on and not hear any of the noise out in the hallway. But in promoting use to show that it really is a national democratic institution, it means sometimes there's overuse, but it's open. Yeah.
Thank you.
I thought I saw another hand up. Tim, did you have, who did I saw another hand up?
Yeah, I did have a question. So wonderful presentation, really enjoyable, amazing. And you had mentioned about the collections and the source of collections. Did you do any research on that side of things, about the actual where the collections came from, their sources? And
and in the book, in each chapter on each library, those kind of details will be there. One of the things that's been really interesting about researching this topic is that most of the works and please nobody here be offended, right? but most of the works about the National Libraries have been written by librarians, and often librarians who work for the National Library. And frankly, they don't know how to tell a good story. So you end up with a list of, here are all our donors and bequests, and like, so what? So what about who those people were? Tell me something about what they gave and why it's important. Tell me something about the story. How did this expand the collection? And so one of the things Peter and I are really trying to do in crafting this is not simply reiterate each library's, standard press potted histories on their websites, but to try and flesh those out and look at some of the things that are unusual. So anyway, we're trying to make it a more lively story that, people who love books generally and maybe aren't completely taken with cataloging principles, for example, still find interesting. And to that end, one little factoid that I can't get into this talk, but I just think is really fascinating. When the National Library of Ireland was trying to put its catalog together, and of course, cataloging for such a huge library is perennially running behind. And before we had digital options, you were trying to set things, and by the time you got them set and proofread, you already had to cut them apart and put other things in. So one of the ways that they were getting the cataloging done in the early 20th century was asking for volunteers in prison who were literate to catalog, transfer catalog data over. And that's going into our book somewhere. I think that's just really interesting, but it was something I kind of stumbled across in a careful read through every one of the annual reports for the Board of Trustees for the National Library of Ireland, which, reading board meeting notes usually isn't very interesting, but every once in a while you find something that's a gem. And we're going to try and put some of those sort of fluky, interesting human interest, how does this really get done stories in there. So it's not just all about shelf marks and press marks. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a little like the Mad Men and the Professor and the OED.
Yep.
And of course, the Irish were quite literate, and it doesn't make any difference whether you were a crook or not. You're probably still quite literate. Yeah. One of the other things I would note is that I think the British won in the National Library contest over France. The French New Bibliothèque is quite remote and really quite cold. And a far cry from the original. So
well, it's a pretty design, and they've set it up so that it looks like 4 open volumes that face around a courtyard. And when you back up enough, or you see a photograph that's far enough away, you go, "Oh, that's cool." But conceptually, it's not warm. I'm sure it's efficient for book stacks, and you're always balancing those.
Yeah.
How do we get more books in? What do we do about space for actually using them? And that makes some compromises, but I've become quite a connoisseur of national libraries. Anytime we go anywhere, I go wandering in and out of them to sort of see how are you laid out. It's fun.
Well, what a great topic to be researching and writing about. I want to thank you again for stepping up and sharing this with us. It was just so interesting, a wonderful way to spend a Sunday afternoon and keynote our annual meeting. If there any other questions of Solveig or Ryan, did I see your hand up there?
Yeah, just a comment. It's not a question, but your presentation explained why the National Museum of Wales is in Cardiff and the National Library is in Aberystwyth. Yeah. I've taken the train all the way to Aberystwyth, and it is a bit of a trek there. Yeah.
It looks like that building might have been designed by Lutyens, but I don't know. The one in, who designed the Welsh?
I've got it in my notes somewhere, but no, I don't know right offhand.
Yeah, it's probably not Lutyens. You would have.
Yeah. It is a very beautiful. I actually took that photograph, and it's a very beautiful beautiful site. You're up overlooking the bay and looking out to sea, and On a sunny day, it's just absolutely gorgeous. And on a rainy day, it's Wales.
Right. Okay, well, I want to thank everybody again for coming. I wish we had our cupcakes. Jane was going to provide cupcakes, and I was going to bring some champagne, but we'll have to do it each in our own houses. Maybe we'll be maybe we can get together. We're trying to plan for for our holiday dinner, which if we have it, will probably be in November. But that's still stay tuned, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon. We are adjourned. Bye-bye.